The finest ship in the world has been left and is lying like a useless saucepan kicking about on the most exposed shore that you can imagine, with no more effort or skill applied to protect the property than the said saucepan would have received on the beach at Brighton. It is really shocking.
Brunel designed a breakwater made out of faggots to protect the ship during the winter, and despite the most terrible storms, it worked. In the spring, there began the most complicated and tortuous salvage operation to lift her out of the sand and repair her bottom before the high spring tides could lift her and float her over the rocks that surround the beach. They eventually managed it, but the Great Western Steamship Company went broke in the process, and when the Great Britain sailed again, she had been sold to new owners. Gibbs, Bright and Company gave her new engines, 2 funnels, took away another mast, and prepared her for the run between Liverpool and Australia. She had been refitted with no expense spared. The old saloon was turned into cargo space, and a new deckhouse was built to provide for the 730 passengers. It was comfortable enough, so long as everybody stuck to the rules.
Breakfast to be at 8 o'clock, and at 9 the cloth to be removed, after which nothing will be served. Passengers are requested to allow ladies to occupy the seats most convenient for retiring from the dinner table.
In 1852, she set out on the long voyage to Australia. Everyone, including the newspapers, was confident of her success.
The Great Britain is fully equipped to resist any attempt to attack the vessel, for she is mounted with 6 heavy guns and arms and ammunition for 100 men. It is confidently expected that she will reach Melbourne in 56 days, whereas double that time is considered average for a sailing vessel.
In fact, as her log shows, it took her 82 days because she ran out of coal halfway through the voyage. This first trip to Melbourne was the start of 25 years ploughing backwards and forwards between Britain and Australia. Apart from carrying troops to the Crimea and reinforcements to quell the Indian Mutiny, she visited Sydney so regularly that she became part of the local scene. Her master, Captain Gray, decided to cut her down to 3 masts instead of 4, and complete with her own newspaper, she made 32 runs to Australia before she was finally retired and laid up in Liverpool. But it wasn't the end, not quite. She was sold after 5 years' idleness for £6,500. It was in 1882 when her new owners removed her engines altogether, rigged her as a pure sailing ship, and fitted her as a cargo boat. For some reason, they covered her hull in wood, though nobody knows why. In 1886, she started her last voyage to San Francisco, carrying coal. She never arrived. She was damaged in a storm rounding Cape Horn and put back for repairs to the Falkland Islands. In Port Stanley, although the damage turned out to be little more than a strained deck, it was decided to write her off as a dead loss. Why they did this is still something of a mystery. But whatever the reason, she was sold to the Falkland Islands Company as a hulk and stripped down to become a storehouse for coal and wool. They stripped her of anything valuable they could lay their hands on. They sold her sails and her rigging, and they cut great holes in her starboard side so that the bales of wool could be loaded on and off without difficulty. It was a sad-looking ship that lay in Port Stanley, and a miserable job for an historic ship like the Great Britain. She stayed here for 47 years until her decks began to leak and there was no use left in her even as a hulk. So they brought tugs and they towed her out of Port Stanley. They took her round the coast to a place called Sparrow Cove, and here they found a piece of beach and they ran her ashore. She was supposed to rust away and fall apart like any other wreck. They banged holes in her stern so that she would sink once and for all and settle in the sand. And that, they thought, was that. But it wasn't. 34 years later, in 1968, she was still there. In this open bay, where all the weather from the Atlantic had swept in year after year, Brunel's construction had held up and survived. For years, visitors looked at that beautiful bow, still majestic even without its bowsprit, and they said, what a pity to leave her there to rot. And some said, why can't she be saved? And nobody did anything, and she went on rotting, though some of her figurehead remained. Her 3 great masts stood towering up, and great areas of her deck had either rotted or been taken away and used for building. Her deck winches were still there, rusted up, but as sound as the day they were built. One of her yards still hung from her mainmast, and her frames were still in place, just as the shipwrights had cut them out in 1839 by laboriously drilling hole after hole. All very well to dream of bringing her back to Britain, but when you look at the desolation that time, men and weather had caused, it makes you think that only a fanatical romantic would have the courage actually to try. No decks left at all inside. Nothing but a mass of rusty iron girders, crisscrossing and marking out in space the areas where top-hatted gentlemen and crinolined ladies strolled arm in arm to work up an appetite for dinner. Not so much as a cabin wall or a door to show where the first-class staterooms were, and even the windows in the great stern gallery boarded up, where the ladies would sit and sew and gaze out at the long, straight line of her wake. And yet, looking at this hull with this magnificent stern, there were some people who thought that it wasn't an impossible task to bring her home and save her from this final stage of decay. This crack in her side was the biggest problem, caused mainly by the hole cut in her side so that she could be loaded easily as a hulk. Only nobody could tell how bad the crack was and how far under the water it went. In fact, the problems of bringing the ship home were enormous, and nobody even knew what half these problems were. In the winter of 1968, this ship arrived in Port Stanley. HMS Endurance is a naval hydrographic ship. It was Dr. Corlett's plan, with the help given by the Royal Navy, to carry out a survey and see if indeed it was possible to bring the Great Britain home. HMS Endurance carried all the men and all the equipment necessary to survey not only the ship, but also the waters of Sparrow Cove. It was no good planning how to salvage the ship if there wasn't enough depth of water to get the salvage equipment alongside. Equally, it was no good sending expensive equipment all the way to the Falkland Islands if the ship was too far gone, never to float again. At first sight, neither the bay nor the ship itself looked particularly hopeful. They started work in the grey Atlantic mist, sending divers down to look at the hull and inspect every inch of rusting iron that they could reach. The crew of Endurance found that the only chart of Sparrow Cove had been made sometime in the last century by the crew of a visiting sailing ship. So they simply set to and made a completely new survey. One thing was abundantly obvious. This was not the place that anyone would have chosen to carry out any kind of salvage.
Stand by. Are you ready? Ready. Fix.
In the end, they decided that there was enough water to float the ship, and it would be possible to tow her out, if she could be made to float. And here again, the surveyors and the divers decided that it might be possible to make her float, and there was a chance of closing the crack in her hull, just as long as the damage didn't get any worse. But it was here in England that the plan was finally worked out. This is Basingstoke, where Dr. Corlett has his office, and where he works as a regular marine architect, quite apart from his interest in the Great Britain. Two things were required: a plan to make the salvage possible, and secondly, an organization to manage the whole operation and raise a lot of money.
It remains now to effect the actual salvage of the vessel. We have carried out a preliminary or a feasibility survey, which was moderately encouraging, and thanks to the generosity of many individuals and concerns, we have the necessary finance.